Until now, no Western leader, including the United States, has been willing to make the basic and just realistic point of the fact that Ukraine is not going to join NATO. Right now, we are seeing the crumbling of the years-long fantasy that a lot of neocons and a lot of liberal interventionist hawks have been pushing.
Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Today's guest is Branko Marcetic. First, over at Undercurrents TV, though, you can join the Undercurrents community where you get a special weekly newsletter from me, a private email address to get in contact with us, and paywalled episodes of the show. Please also subscribe on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Now let's get on to the news. On Tuesday, the U.S. and Russia, according to, let's just say, a flamboyant description in the New York Times, quote, moved toward a head-spinning reset of their relationship. After a meeting with senior Russian officials in Riyadh, Secretary of State Marco Rubio told the Associated Press that both countries, quote, agreed broadly to pursue three goals: to restore staffing at their respective embassies in Washington and Moscow, to create a high-level team to support Ukraine peace talks, and to explore closer relations and economic cooperation. This obviously comes after Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth angered some Republicans by saying this last week in Brussels.
The United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. Instead, any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops.
Donald Trump backed Hegseth up on that point, by the way, even as senators like Roger Wicker compared Hegseth's speech to something a, quote, fool like Tucker Carlson could have written. Meanwhile, NBC News is accusing J.D. Vance of, quote, tearing up Washington's decades-long alliances with his speech at the Munich Security Conference last week, which continues to absolutely ripple throughout geopolitics. Ukrainian President Volodymer Zelensky seemed to agree with NBC News' assessment, remarking on his own, quote, the U.S. Vice President made it clear, decades of the old relationship between Europe and America are ending. From now on, things will be different, and Europe needs to adjust to that. So where does that leave Ukraine? Over the weekend, The Telegraph reported on a, quote, draft of the pre-decisional contract marked privileged and confidential and dated February 7th, 2025, proposed by the Trump administration. Here's more from The Telegraph's report. Donald Trump's demand for a $500 billion payback from Ukraine goes far beyond U.S. control over the country's critical minerals. It covers everything from ports and infrastructure to oil and gas, and the larger resource base of the country. The terms of the contract that landed at Volodymyr Zelensky's office a week ago amount to the U.S. economic colonization of Ukraine in legal perpetuity. It implies a burden of reparations, the Telegraph continues, that cannot possibly be achieved. The document has caused consternation and panic in Kiev. End quote. All of this was unfolding Tuesday, and I saw a post on X from Jacobin writer Branko Marcetic. He wrote on X, quote, listening to talk in the US/West, you'd have no idea that most of Ukraine now says they want a negotiated end. The massive scale of draft dodging, the increasing violence of conscription, and the social resistance to it, the scale of mass desertion, or how Zelensky is underwater and only clings to power undemocratically. That's what Branko wrote, and he linked to a November Gallup poll of Ukrainians and their perspective on the war to back up his point. Hundreds of thousands of people are now dead as a result of Putin's invasion and the war that followed. Branko joins us now to break down the swirl of news this week. Branko, thank you for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Have you ever been the victim of a data breach? I know I have, recently actually, and let me tell you, it's infuriating. It's bad enough that big companies are careless with our personal information, but what really gets me, they never seem to face any real consequences for it. Meanwhile, no one is putting in any effort to actually protect our privacy from American companies that profit off of our data. That's why I don't leave my online security up to chance. I use Aura, today's sponsor, to keep my information safe. Because, let's be honest, no one else is going to do it for us. Aura does the hard work for me. First, they track down data brokers who are selling my personal information and submit opt-out requests on my behalf. Give it a few weeks, and I actually stopped seeing my info pop up in search results, which means less spam, fewer robocalls, and more control over my data. Aura also monitors the dark web around the clock and alerts me if my personal details, like passwords or social security numbers, are floating around where they shouldn't be. And if someone tries to use my information to access my bank or credit accounts, Aura lets me know fast so I can take action before any damage is done. And here's some serious peace of mind. Aura offers up to $5 million in identity theft insurance. So if the worst happens, I'm covered. Oh, and did I mention Aura includes a VPN with 100 plus virtual locations. So whether I'm working remotely or just trying to keep my browsing private, I know my connection is secure. Does your current VPN offer all of this? I didn't think so. Stop leaving yourself vulnerable to data breaches and data brokers. Go to aura.com/undercurrents to Try Aura free for 14 days. That's enough time to find out just how much of your personal information is already exposed and take the first step to locking it down. Stay safe out there. It's a really busy week on the Ukrainian question because everything that happened last week is setting the tone for everything that's now happening this week. We know that Secretary of State Marco Rubio just met with Sergei Lavrov and others in Riyadh in relation to a potential peace plan. We have a leaked version of what the U.S. proposal is, which would be the Telegraph described it as economic colonization of Ukraine, essentially going forward. And that's all on top of the swirl around J.D. Vance's Munich speech. So I just want to start by asking where we sort of stand right now, because it's very confusing to try to figure out where the Trump administration is, where Zelensky is, and what's actually happening. Do you have a good read on the situation?
I don't think anyone has a great read. I think that where we are is we're at the start of a process. I mean, it was never Trump's "I'm going to end the war within 24 hours" promise was, I think, never a realistic one. It's kind of classic Trump bluster. It's him kind of signaling his intention to seriously pursue talks to end the war, but not actually, meant to be taken literally. It was never going to be ended in 24 hours because there's so much to hash out in these negotiations, and so many different players involved. I mean, right now we're still not even sure what the eventual talks, what they're actually going to look like. Is Europe going to be involved? They seem to have been kind of shunted to the side. Ukraine also seems to have been, at the moment at least, shunted to the side. It seems like Trump is a side that should be a U.S. Russia thing entirely. Whether that'll be the case, I don't know. There's also uncertainty about what exactly is the Trump administration's overall strategy, because obviously it talked a good game of peace during the campaign, but then at the same time, Trump is surrounded by people who are former Russia hawks, Ukraine war hawks, who have kind of recalibrated their positions based on Trump's own rhetoric. But then also they have said things along the lines of basically they're going to make an ultimatum to Russia that if they don't agree to the kind of terms that Trump proposes, that perhaps they will actually escalate U.S. involvement in the war and do more than Biden was willing to do to inflict damage on Russia as a way to get it to the table. So, yeah, I mean, I would say a lot of uncertainty. I do not have a very clear read of what is going on. I'm encouraged. And I think that, again, we are at the start of a process that is going to unfold over the coming months. And we'll just have to see how that goes.
Yeah, George Will had a predictably sort of hysterical column about all of this, but I'm curious if you put yourself in the shoes of a George Will right now. Would you be hysterical about the signs you're seeing from the Trump administration? Pete Hegseth last week ruling NATO membership out for Ukraine. Trump backed him up on that point. Media said that he sort of backpedaled from that. I didn't read backpedaling into it so much as he tried to, signal that he still, I guess, kind of likes Ukraine is one way to put it. But should intense neoconservative Ukraine hawks be freaking out about this?
I mean, yes, in the sense of until now, no Western leader, including the United States, has been willing to make the basic and just realistic point of the fact that Ukraine is not going to join NATO. This has been a thing that they have been dangling in front of Ukraine, particularly over the last 2 or 3 years, but for much longer than that. And they keep saying that Ukraine will one day join NATO, and of course there have been moves to more closely integrate Ukraine into NATO militarily, which is part of the reason why this war started in the first place. But time and time again, leaders have also shown they're not actually willing to pull the trigger on that, let alone to actually even fully come out and defend Ukraine, put US lives on the line to defend Ukraine, which you would have to do if Ukraine was a NATO partner and Article 5 was triggered. So if you're not willing to kind of go that far at the moment, it's very unlikely that you would actually want to do that and commit yourself to doing it, making it part of NATO. So I think in the sense that right now we are seeing the crumbling of the years-long fantasy that a lot of neocons and a lot of liberal interventionist hawks have been pushing about this war and about the long Ukraine crisis generally. I think they have a right to freak out because suddenly all these things that these kind of, I mean, I'm going to be blunt, these lies that were undergirding every single thing that we were watching in this war for the past few years, they are starting to no longer be committed to by the people who are meant to be, advancing them in public. And a lot of this has run on kind of this fantastical architecture until now. So the fact that the people are losing buy-in to this probably is worrying for the George Wills of the world.
And you made a good point on Twitter, which I guess I have to call X now, but you were saying Zelensky has lost a lot of leverage just among his own people over the course of, the last couple of years, but especially recently. He's underwater and he only clings to power undemocratically. Social resistance, mass desertion, draft dodging, all of these things, conscription. The Wall Street Journal itself reported about 40-something-year-old men being pulled off the street at one point. Could you tell us just a little bit, for people who have been listening to, quote, talk in the U.S. and the West, as you put it, who maybe haven't even heard some of those points before, kind of what it looks like on the ground in Ukraine for Zelensky with his own people?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the frustrating things about the war and has been from the very beginning. The way that it's portrayed in the rhetoric of Western officials and in Western media is that basically Ukraine is a country of people that is willing to just endlessly be mowed down and die and have their limbs and eyes shot out until victory, whenever victory comes, and that they are implacably hostile to negotiations. They do not want to compromise on ceding some land if it means peace, and so on and so forth. Now, don't get me wrong, there are people in Ukraine, many people in Ukraine, who definitely have that position and had that position more strongly at the start of the war. But the idea that the entire country is unanimously can be ascribed in this way is just ridiculous. It's a very convenient one for people like Boris Johnson, who want to say that, oh, this is great. These people just want to fight and die, and we can just give them weapons endlessly for them to do that. The reality is much more complicated and much grimmer, as you're pointing out there. Number one, Zelensky is kind of treated as the tribune of the Ukrainian people, when in reality he is deeply unpopular. His popularity has massively dropped since the start of the war. The reason that he is still in power is that because he used the declaration of martial law to indefinitely delay elections. So if he had elections now, there's very real doubt that he would actually end up winning them. And yet what Zelensky says is treated as kind of the authentic representation of what Ukrainians think. I mean, beyond that, this idea that all Ukrainians are just committed to fighting the war forever and ever, no matter how much it costs them, is just not true. I mean, it was not true at the start of the war, number one. Public opinion, it goes up and down, but at the start of the war, it was definitely not true. And we also have very good reason to have some skepticism towards some of the public opinion polls, because Ukraine, particularly during the war, has been a very repressive state that has prosecuted tens of thousands of people for voicing anti-war or pro-peace opinions, or for saying things that would otherwise be cast as treasonous or pro-Russian in the most kind of broad definition of that term. So in that kind of climate where you have repression, censorship, and people are afraid to actually speak their mind, do you think you can really get a good gauge of public opinion? I do not think so. I think one gauge of public opinion is some of what you talked about there, the massive amount of desertions from the military. I think last I saw, 100,000 people have been prosecuted, soldiers have been prosecuted for deserting over the course of this war. Those are massive numbers, and that shows the unwillingness of people who are conscripted, who know they're just getting sent to the front line to die pointlessly. their unwillingness to actually fight, as does the fact that tens of thousands of people have made this all kinds of perilous and sometimes wacky attempts to get out of the country and leave and not come back for fear of being conscripted. And that conscription, by the way, increasingly what that looks like is someone is walking along the road, minding their own business, and a van pulls up and a bunch of military recruiters jump out and try to force that person into the van so they can take them to the front line. And then sometimes they meet resistance from Ukrainian people around them, who end up having a fight with them and stop the person from being conscripted. Does any of what I just described, does that sound like a nation of people that is willing to just be endlessly fed into a meat grinder for the sake of some land?
Right. And it sounds like a president without a ton of leverage going into these kind of conversations. She's losing that buy-in from the U.S. and from his own people. I want to read you part of the George Will column in the Washington Post that I referenced earlier, because he tries to take J.D. Vance to task. And so he writes, Vance, who has said, quote, "I don't really care what happens to Ukraine," unquote, might someday care. He quotes the American strategist Nicholas Speckman referencing a European event that precipitated World War I in 1914 and another that accelerated the 1930s economic catastrophe. Quote, the murder of an Austrian archduke brought 1 million soldiers to Europe, and the failure of an Austrian credit institution closed all the banks in the U.S. So Will is invoking that quote to say J.D. Vance may care what happens in Ukraine someday. I'm really curious what you make of that, Branko, because to me it does seem like the most serious manifestation of the neoconservative argument that this is a really important, it's important for Ukraine to sort of be a bulwark here, but what do you make of it?
I mean, people love to talk about how much they care about Ukraine and how everything, when they're pushing for this war to never end, for this country that is being pulverized to just continually fight this forever and ever, that this is all in the best interest of Ukraine. There's no discussion of the actual costs that have been inflicted on the country as a result of the exact policy that people like George Will and people of his ilk have been saying is the right way to go. Ukraine at the moment is a country facing not just a severe economic crisis. I mean, its economy contracted by a third as a result of the war. But it's deeply, deeply in debt. And before Trump came along, by the way, it was going to be used as leverage for basically pushing deeper neoliberal austerity onto the country. It's half of its infrastructure is destroyed, which was not the case when negotiations were happening and actually bearing fruit in early 2022. That's all the result of the war being prolonged and escalated. It's facing a social demographic crisis because so many young people have left the country either as refugees or otherwise just to get out of having to fight. And obviously they see the country as having pretty bleak prospects and they are not very keen to come back. So what you have is an increasingly aging population, and not just an aging population, but a population of war veterans, a large number of war veterans who are deeply injured, who have lost limbs, who have lost parts of their faces, who are horrifically traumatized from what they've seen. All of these things are going to have social costs down the line. So, I mean, this is all the product of the exact policy that Will has put forward. I mean, he's right that this is that what he's talking about is a possibility for the country, but it's in large part a possibility because of the fact that people push this idea that the country should just say no to any peace talks and say no to any sort of concessions and just try and fight until victory. But yeah, we don't hear about any of the negatives that have come from that, even though they are very, very severe.
And I think he even references this in the column. It seems to me that argument continues to be predicated on the idea that Putin has, the same Lebensraum ambitions of Hitler, that this is part of a territorial expansion across the continent that are part of Putin's long-term ambitions for Russia. And I guess I'm curious, Branko, how you see that, the likelihood of that being true now in mid-February 2025, because that they need that to make this argument. And I don't know, the case for it has gotten much stronger.
Well, I mean, This is why there has been such intense pushback on the idea that this war is related to NATO expansion and the kind of creeping encroachment of NATO into Ukraine and on Russia's border. Part of it is people just don't want to admit that this is a bad policy and that the United States and NATO powers might hold some responsibility as well as Putin for what is happening. So part of it is that, but part of it is also that they want to shift the narrative onto, well, this is we're seeing the new Hitler, this is the new Nazi Germany, and what they want to do is they want to sweep across all of Europe and take it over, and that there isn't really any indication of that. As people like myself have pointed out endlessly, Putin and other Russian officials have repeatedly said that the reason why they're doing this is over NATO. The presence of NATO and the militarization of Ukraine has been maybe the central issue in all of the negotiations that were happening. They were also central to the negotiations that Putin tried to start with Biden when he was basically amassing all those troops on the Ukrainian border and essentially threatening to invade the country if the US did not negotiate with it. Beyond that, for people who still want to believe this idea that this is all just about conquering Europe, which it's highly doubtful Russia can even do if it can't conquer Ukraine. But if you want to believe in this idea, then what do we make of the fact that the former NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, said outright last year that this war is about NATO and that Putin started the war because NATO refused to rule out Ukraine from joining it? Or the fact that US officials like Admiral Haynes have said the exact same thing. It's just this really just has no credibility anymore. The evidence is overwhelming. I'm not going to say that Russian nationalism and the social influence of Russian nationalists who do believe in this crazy idea of a Russia that takes over Europe doesn't have any influence. Of course it does. There's many things that go into it. But I think the central animating problem here has always been NATO. And again, the fact that even NATO officials have said that, I think kind of makes this a pointless argument to keep having.
In turning to the details of the peace proposal that have leaked, I'm curious if we contextualize this with the USAID backlash on the right that's happening now. It used to really be the domain of the left to critique that as colonialism, essentially, or blackmail, a network of blackmail. Now people on the right, including the administration that JD Vance represents, are rightfully understanding USAID for what it is, at the same time as proposing the economic colonization of Ukraine, which is interesting because that's sort of what USAID was doing with Hunter Biden and Burisma. So, Branko, as somebody who watches this and has watched the evolution of the foreign policy right very closely, what do you make? Is there a tension there? Is this sort of the neoconservative wing of the Republicans getting a little, while the realists get a little? What's going on?
To some extent, both sides of this debate seem to kind of pick and choose their principles and then decide when they want to apply them and when they don't. You're right. People have talked about USAID as on the right as for colonization or basically the US meddling in another country. And here in this deal for this rare earths mineral deal that Trump is proposing to Ukraine, it's it's basically full on colonization. It's
transparent.
Basically all the spoils. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. all the spoils of resource extraction. This resource rich country. But it's the same thing on the kind of liberal democratic side where there's all this talk about neo-colonialism and neo-imperialism. When it comes to Russia's invasion, which I would argue does qualify as that, but then there's absolutely no talk about the fact that long-standing U.S. policy, including during the war under Biden, was to effectively use military aid to Ukraine to leverage the country's opening up to foreign exploitation. Including those same resources that we're talking about. I'm glad, I guess, it's getting outraged now, but the Trump's proposal is just the kind of most extreme and brazen version of what has been long-standing U.S. policy. Part of the whole Burisma Hunter Biden scandal. People forget, what was Joe Biden doing in Ukraine? Part of his job, and we can see this in some of the recordings of the phone calls that were released between him and the former president Poroshenko. Part of his job was pressuring Ukrainian officials to make certain policy changes, like, for instance, cutting off gas subsidies that made it affordable for Ukrainians who live in one of the poorest countries in Europe to be able to afford to heat their homes during the bitter winters, to push for asset sell-offs, privatization that would be bought up, of course, by wealthy Western multinationals. Or in 2020, under the first Trump administration, Trump was finally able to secure this long-standing U.S. push to change the law so that Ukrainian farmland, very, very rich farmland, could be sold to private buyers. And of course, the most of the buyers since then have been foreign companies as well as sort of oligarchs within the country. So, this is I'm glad that people are finally angry about this, but it's been long overdue because this has been long-standing U.S. policy. And unfortunately, the hypocrisy around this kind of, is on both quarters.
Branko, thank you so much for your time. This is all crazy to follow right now, so I appreciate it.
It is for me too. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for tuning into today's edition of Undercurrents. I told Branko this right after we wrapped, but he's been on my list for a long time of voices to get on the show. It's always good to talk to people left, right, who have ideas that aren't getting a lot of play. And he's someone who is so sharp that even if you disagree with him, it's great to sort of flesh out his perspective. I actually mostly agree with him on this, as you could probably tell, and don't agree much with that kind of centrist position that we were talking about vis-a-vis George Will, who really wouldn't be considered a centrist on foreign policy until recently, as the neoconservatives have started kind of clinging to power. So on that note, appreciate everybody's time. Please make sure to subscribe over at undercurrents.tv to the Undercurrents community. You get a weekly email from me and a private email address to get in touch with me and the show and ask questions that we can respond to, and you get paywalled episodes. Subscribe on YouTube, wherever you download your podcasts, and we'll see you back here with more Undercurrents soon.